Hi everyone, Rick Russell here. Stand by for channel markers.
But the evening times quiet ways. Although we have had considerable success in our role in the Pacific, we still have a long ways to go before we can assure the defeat of Japan. The Japanese fleet is still strong, although it has suffered heavy losses. The Japanese forces as a whole are efficient, well trained, and full of fight. However, the Pacific Fleet is ready to take on the Japanese fleet at any time and any place. The sooner the better. How's that?
The American way of war envisions the application of overwhelming force. It doesn't want a fair fight. Admiral King was determined then to build as large a naval force as possible that would engage and destroy the enemy at the times and places of the Allies' choosing at minimum cost. More ships meant more operations. More operations meant a faster end of the war, King said. Politicians had already agreed to accept nothing less than the unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan. But when such a victory would be won was still difficult to predict. In any event, the war wouldn't be over in 1944. As a result, despite the growing burden on national resources, especially the drain on manpower, and as the other services complained, Admiral King pressed ahead with his massive warship building program. In January 1944, King's Navy was enormous by any standard. Though committed heavily in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, so was the lion's share of the Royal Navy. Not surprisingly, then, the bulk of U.S. naval strength was committed to defeating Japan. At this time, the U.S. Navy had 8 fast battleships in commission. All were in the Pacific. The 9th and 10th, Wisconsin, then Missouri, would join them during the year. Of the 13 old battleships, 8 were serving in the Pacific. The other 5 would join them by the end of the year. The 7 new Essex-class carriers formed the spearhead of Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet striking force. They were augmented by pre-war flat-tops Saratoga and Enterprise, as well as all 9 Independence-class small carriers. During 1944, another 7 Essex-class carriers would be commissioned. Admiral King was also well on his way to getting his desired total of 100 escort carriers. For a war that could easily last beyond 1946, Admiral King had 11 more Essex-class carriers and 3 of the larger Midway-class carriers coming. Nor did the Navy suffer from a shortage of cruisers, destroyers, submarines, or small combatants, or frankly, auxiliaries of any type. Speaking of cruisers, the first 2 Alaska-class large cruisers with 12-inch guns and 5 Baltimore-class heavy cruisers, the first 8-inch gun cruisers commissioned since 1939, had entered the fleet by the end of 1944. Larger and faster-firing versions of the Navy's excellent cruisers were on the drawing boards.
Oh, thanks, Freddie, foreshadowing.
As a result, in 1944, the mailed fist of American industrial might relentlessly battered the hard-pressed Axis powers. In the Mediterranean, the Germans were giving ground. In the East, the relentless meat-grinding advance of the Red Army brutalized the Wehrmacht. And the Anglo-American Second Front was still to come. Among Germany's battleships, only Tirpitz survived, tucked away in a Norwegian fjord, doomed to elimination before the end of the year. In the Pacific, Japan was back on its heels. Just as they had assaulted both Bougainville, New Guinea, and Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands simultaneously in November 1943, in January 1944, Marines and Army troops took Kwajalein and Majuro in the Marshall Islands. Given the relative ease with which these future bases were taken, Admiral Nimitz accelerated the Central Pacific offensive. Carrier raids, which early in 1942 had become legendary for their daring strikes at an aggressive enemy, became commonplace. Carriers attacked shipping at New Ireland and at the Bastion of Rabaul. No enemy airfield or anchorage was safe, it seemed, and in February 1944, carriers attacked the legendary Japanese fleet base at Truk Atoll. In fact, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 50, ignored carrier raid doctrine and flattened Truk not on a single day as doctrine advised, but on back-to-back days. With 9 carriers and 6 battleships on hand, the first day began with a fighter sweep of 75 Hellcat fighters. The 2-day raid inflicted massive damage, destroying hundreds of aircraft and sinking 200,000 tons of shipping. So feared had U.S. power become that Admiral Koga, who had succeeded Yamamoto as Navy Commander-in-Chief, left in battleship Musashi at the first sight of reconnaissance aircraft earlier in the month. Within days of this attack, Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, Nimitz's fast carriers, attacked Saipan for the first time. The Navy popped up everywhere, with destroyers, for example, escorting high-speed transports to complete the strategic encirclement of Rabaul on New Britain, allowing it to be leapfrogged, while also bombarding Japanese positions in the Kuril Islands, situated between Hokkaido and Soviet Kamchatka in the North Pacific. Never had one Navy held the ability to project such overwhelming military and naval power globally. Proving the point, in June 1944, the U.S. Navy launched a massive effort to conquer the Marianas Islands, starting at Saipan, less than 10 days after executing the largest amphibious operation ever conceived in France at Normandy. On 19 and 20 June, when Japanese Admiral Ozawa contested the U.S. landings on Saipan, the fifth and final carrier battle of the war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, resulted in the annihilation of Japanese naval aviation. In what was dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, some 260 Japanese planes were shot down on the first day. Adding insult to injury, U.S. submarines sank Japanese carriers Taiho and Pearl Harbor veteran Shokaku. The next day, in what became known as the Mission Beyond Darkness, U.S. carrier aircraft sank 1 light carrier while damaging Pearl Harbor veteran Zuikaku and 2 smaller carriers. Admiral Mitcher famously turned on the lights to guide the pilots home. Clearly, the overriding question was not whether the Allies would win the war. The questions were how and when would they win, and what would it cost. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the fight over manpower was quickly becoming King's biggest problem. The Navy had at great expense and effort forged a vast industrial complex adequate to build and support the huge fleet envisioned by planners and authorized by Congress. So far, King had successfully resisted efforts by the other services to bring the Navy to heel by placing fleet expansion and its insatiable need for resources and men under joint control. But the Navy didn't have a reliable method for estimating its manpower needs, so that it was surprised time and again when the operating fleet and shore establishment, as well as the shipyards and even the white-collar bureaucracy, needed more people. It also meant questions about fleet size would not go away. With the support of Navy Secretary Knox, King had exercised more or less exclusive control over planning the Navy's fleet strength. But in May, Knox died from a heart attack. Undersecretary of the Navy James Forrestal became the new Navy Secretary. Months earlier, Forrestal had gotten on King's bad side by wondering out loud if the final 2 Iowa-class battleships, Illinois and Kentucky, were really needed to win the war. King and Forrestal quickly developed a strong mutual dislike, but King did create a cutback committee, giving the growing disparity between the projected fleet size and available manpower. It was the Navy's first serious attempt to figure out what it needed to conduct the war successfully, but in the end, few to no ships were cut. Looking for efficiencies elsewhere, the Navy even tried reducing crew complements to below optimum levels. In the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz and his staff did their part by balking at any proposed cuts, especially to older ships. By late summer 1944, success in France seriously reduced the Navy's Atlantic commitments. Large numbers of naval units would be transferred to the Pacific, where despite ongoing success, the fleet was still thousands of miles from its ultimate objective. Though planners were looking for cuts to fleet strength, and the destroyer escort and submarine programs had already been reduced, Nimitz wanted all the ships he could get, and he wanted the new carriers even sooner. The Japanese Navy still had operational carriers, and the final defeat of their Army and Air Force was a long way off. The Bureau ships complied, but work needed to be necessarily slowed on Illinois and Kentucky, the large cruiser Hawaii, and several other cruisers. Focusing on carrier task forces, King's staff worked to systematize planning for fleet strength by assigning a set number of aircraft and types of ships needed to escort carriers and battleships. By September 1944, Forrestal was more or less under control, and King and Nimitz were on the same page. The next steps required the forces under Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur to converge on the southern Philippines. From there, they could assault Formosa or Luzon, then penetrate the Japanese inner defense perimeter by invading Okinawa, and ultimately advance on the home islands. What resulted was the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October, the largest naval battle since Jutland in 1916. It's too complex to recall here, but it did involve the largest concentration of U.S. battleships ever, with 8 fast and 7 old battleships present. As we know, the old battleships had a more satisfying fight than the fast battleships. Though Leyte Gulf was viewed as an incomplete victory, it finished the Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. By the end of the year, the Japanese Navy would be left with only 2 carriers and 3 battleships. By December, organized resistance ended on Leyte. At Norfolk Navy Yard, work even resumed on Battleship Kentucky, with her completion projected for mid-1946. On the 15th, King and Nimitz, along with Leahy, were all promoted to 5-star rank. The Navy had a lot to be proud of, from Normandy and Saipan to Leyte Gulf. It had also survived another year of bureaucratic wrangling, and its expansion program was secure from external and internal interference. Never complacent, to get further increases, King would need an ally able to outmuscle Forrestal. Carl Vinson was about to re-enter the picture. That's all for this channel marker. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment or recommend another subject below. As always, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.